Welcome, everybody. This is an ordinary meeting of the Philological Society. It is on Zoom. It was supposed to have been held in Edinburgh, but I'm very pleased to announce that this is the Early Career Researcher Panel entitled Historical Work with Unwritten Languages. It was organized by Laura Arnold, and she and her co-participants have arranged a real treat for us. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ricardo, who is the chair for the session, who will then introduce the other participants. Thank you very much, Ricardo. Over to you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you all for coming. I will share my screen with you. Just a quick. So also I would like to thank Laura for inviting me to chair this session. Some people might be asking, who's this guy? Why is he interested? So I'll just talk a little bit of myself. I've done a lot of historical linguistics and I've worked on certain languages, but for some coincidence, I'm interested in all of the languages and the language families that people are talking about today. And I've thought a lot about this topic. I wish I had done more work on unwritten languages, but I have lots of ideas, and Laura and I talked about this a lot, so she invited me and I accepted this kind invitation. Okay, so when organizing this panel, Laura was thinking about this main question. Let's see. How different is the study of change in languages with little to no historical record? How different is the study of change in languages with little to no historical record and compared to those with a lengthy written tradition, or some typos there? Then this is because historical linguistics has strong ties to written sources, mostly of Indo-European languages. I put the Indo in parentheses there because actually we have a lot of data on European languages. We don't even know so much, I would dare say, about Indo-Aryan languages. And there is this implicit assumption that historical work based on spoken data is less reliable or accurate. But on the other hand, there is a tradition of successfully conducted historical research on languages without a written record. And at the same time, there are various techniques with solid empirical validity to describe variation and change in contact and etc. So we do have some tools, and this is what's sort of guiding us all today in this panel and all the talks. Okay, so first we'll have Ryan Gehrmann from Payap University in Thailand. So Ryan is a lecturer there in Thailand, and he has done a lot of work in phonology and phonetics. He has looked at syllable structure, very interesting stuff. I have to ask him lots of questions later. And also Tonogenesis and registrogenesis. And he has done field work in Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Laos, something you'll see today that all of our speakers have done field work. And he has focused on Austroasiatic languages, specifically those from the Katuic and Banaric branches. Next, we have Tatiana Reid from here at the University of Edinburgh. She's a postdoctoral researcher or research assistant. She's also done work in phonetics and phonology, mostly lexical tone, but also some vowels, if I got it right. She has also looked at morphosyntax, specifically verb morphology, and also some lexicography. She's compiling a dictionary, if I'm not mistaken. She has done field work in South Sudan and in Kenya. And she has focused on Nilotic or West Nilotic languages. Finally, our third speaker of today is Laura Arnold, also from the University of Edinburgh. She's a postdoctoral fellow here, and she is also connected to the Center for Endangered Languages Documentation in Indonesia. She has done work on word prosody and morphosyntax, possession, and spatial deixis. She has done a lot of work on language contact and diversification. And she has done fieldwork in New Guinea, Indonesia, on the Indonesian side. And her focus is on Austronesian languages, especially those Rash ones, Raja Ampat South Hamla. Here, I hope I said that right. So very briefly, what we'll be doing today. So this was just the intro. And then we have our talks. So the talks are 20 minutes, and then we have 5 minutes for clarification questions, I should say. Here are the titles, and then after after the talks, we'll have our plenary discussion, which will be around 20 minutes, and then the wrap up. Okay, without further ado, I will give the floor to Ryan. Stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for the kind introductions. And thank you to Philsoc for inviting me to take part in this, and Lara for organizing it. So I am going to be discussing issues in tonogenesis in the greater mainland Southeast Asia area, and two different types of evidence and how we can reconcile the stories that they tell us. So our goal is to discuss periodization specifically in the sound changes that are involved in what we'll call conventional tonogenesis in greater mainland Southeast Asia. An interesting fact about Southeast Asia is that not only has many tone languages, but it has many tone languages that develop tone in parallel ways through the transphonologization of onset phonation and cotophonation contrasts. And as I mentioned, we're going to look at two kinds of evidence, one being the historical or orthographic evidence, and one being comparative evidence drawn from work on modern languages. As I mentioned, the two lines suggest different tonogenetic models or different periodizations, more specifically. And so the question is, are they actually reconcilable, these two stories? And in answering that, it goes to larger questions that we're interested in, such as how to interpret historical data if the story appears to be at odds with the story that the modern languages are telling us when we compare them. So just for context, we're talking about mainland Southeast Asia, but by extension, we're including the Sinitic languages of China. All right, so let's begin with the historical and orthographic evidence that informs this story. So we have modern tonal languages in this part of the world with a long written tradition. There are two predominant orthographic traditions in greater mainland Southeast Asia, one being an Indic tradition of adopting Brahmic scripts for use with languages from Southeast Asia. And Burmese and the Southwestern Thai orthographies like Thai and Lao are the most widely used of those. There are others used for non-tonal languages too. And the second tradition is, of course, the Chinese writing tradition. And that was historically used not only for Chinese, but also for Vietnamese in Southeast Asia. And certain Thai languages actually have small traditions as well. So starting with the Abugidas, the Brahmi-based scripts, the modern Thai script descends from a script developed in the late 13th century in the Kingdom of Sukhothai in northern Thailand. And that script was adapted from the Old Khmer script, which was itself adapted from a South Indian Pallava script. And if we look at the Sukhothai script or the modern Thai script, the tones of modern Thai correspond to two different properties of that orthography, or two different glyphs, we might say. One of those we will call onset voicing, because indeed the glyphs that in question are used to encode differences of voicing in the languages of South Asia. But in the case of Thai, those glyphs now indicate not a difference of onset voicing, but rather of tone. And an innovation in the Sukhothai script over the Old Khmer script was the innovation of two tone marks, which were not needed for Old Khmer. And interestingly enough, this is considered the first known orthographic convention of marking tone in human language, at least that we know of. All right, so just to note that we're only going to discuss syllables that end in a sonorant, consonant, or a vowel. Here, there are issues of tonogenesis in obstruent final syllables too, but it's a little different and a little simpler. So we're going to just restrict ourselves to the sonorant finals here. So in the modern Thai script, the original two tone marks that I mentioned remain in play. And if you look at the tone box that I provided here, you see the colored tone categories there correspond to a combination of the presence or absence of tone marks, cross-cut by differences in what we'll call series of onset consonants, what the Thai tradition calls series. And as I mentioned, these series correspond to voicing contrasts back on the subcontinent. So looking at this, the obvious conclusion to draw is that Sukhothai in the 13th century must have had 3 tones in sonor and final syllables. So they saw fit to develop this tone mark convention. And we can assume that, just based on this, that at some point later, those original 3 tones were split as differences of onset phonation, which were still present at the time when they adopted the script. And hence they chose the voiced and voiceless glyphs. Those became transphonologized as tone in conditioning a tone split. That still doesn't tell us where the original 3 tones come from, but it's a start. All right, switching over to the Sinitic tradition then. I didn't mention before, but obviously in the decision to adopt the Brahmi-based scripts has a lot to do with Buddhism. And Buddhism came to China as well in the early 1st century AD. And Buddhist influence was strong on the Buddhist scribes who were interested in preserving archaic pronunciations of the Chinese characters in order to continue to correctly, in their sense of what the correct pronunciation is the older pronunciation. So they wanted to preserve it. And they came up with a way, influenced by Sanskrit rhyme tables, to create rhyme tables for early Middle Chinese as well. And they broke down syllables into many descriptive categories and more or less developed an Excel spreadsheet template that they applied to the syllables. And 2 of the categories that they're included in their tables correspond to tones in modern Sinitic languages. And this will look familiar to you, I think, because it's quite similar to what we found in the Thai orthography. There are 2 categories that correspond to onset voicing, one of which they called clear and one of which they called muddy, literally. And then there's another category that we tend to call tone group. And that was split into 4. I left off the one associated with obstruent final syllables and gave you the 3 here that are associated with sonor and final syllables. And literally those were described as level, rising, and departing. So if we plot those categories against tones in a modern Sinitic language like Cantonese, you see that you end up with a more or less identical tone box. So we see a familiar pattern, and we begin to see the outline of this convergent tonogenesis that I mentioned at the beginning. And it gets even more interesting, because not only is it structurally convergent, literally words across different language phyla have coherent tonal categories. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you find a word that's in the level category in Sinitic, which is corresponds to the column A in the table on the right here, it will be in the corresponding A category. Its cognate will be in that same category in Vietnamese or Hmong Mien languages or in Thai languages. And that goes for all 3 of the tone categories in question here. This whole concept has been dubbed the sinospheric tone bund by Matisoff, and it perplexed people for a long time. The category correspondences are obviously clear, but what did it reflect? Many people thought it reflected mutual inheritance, and that these tonal languages of Southeast Asia were actually all related, and they have preserved these tonal categories. But closer scrutiny revealed that the actual answer is that these lexical borrowings happened at a time before tonogenesis, and the segments that were borrowed that had tonogenetic potentiality then actually evolved into tone along parallel trajectories across the different language phyla. And Vietnamese provided the key to figuring that out. So the famous tone box for Southeast Asia there shows A, B, and C categories correspond to sonorant codas, glottalized codas, and voiceless fricative codas in the form of like an H-like sound historically. And that was further independently confirmed by other means across the various language families. So we had an overt tonogenetic hypothesis by the mid-20th century, as I've just outlined here, and it was considered to be ordered, sequential. It was considered, even Ojukor in his seminal paper that outlined this for the first time, he even put dates on it, that the coda-phonation contrasts became pitch contours first, and then subsequently onset phonation contrasts split those tones at a later date. So we can even attach a few dates to it if we interpret things in this way. Now, we might ask ourselves, this sequential interpretation, what does it predict? Well, it predicts that we should find languages at 3 different stages in the tonogenetic process, right? Conservative stage 1 languages would preserve coda-phonation. And then in stage 2, the coda-phonation contrast would have been changed into into contrast of pitch contours. And then at stage 3, the onset voicing will have split those tones. So this brings us to the comparative evidence. Do we find that? Well, in fact, we find some problems, because languages which have only transphonologized coda-phonation into tones, or to say that another way, the tones of the modern languages correspond to coda-phonation, historical coda-phonation contrasts only, are barely attested, if at all. And this is a problem because this is actually traditionally the starting point of tonogenesis, supposed to be for this part of the world. And if you survey what we know about the tonal languages that exist today, we find that they come out looking more like outliers. And on the other hand, we find many languages that have transphonologized onset phonation into something resembling tone. And in the Southeast Asian tradition, when that happens, we usually call it register. And register is slightly different from tone, but they are very much overlapping concepts when there's no clear line that can be drawn between them. But nevertheless, historically, they've often been considered separately because of some of the synchronic differences between a tone language and a register language in Southeast Asia. But I and my colleague Ricardo Napoleão have argued recently that there is a case to be made that actually register might be considered the starting point of tonogenesis if we were to ignore this written tradition and the interpretation that developed in the mid-20th century about it. So we developed an alternative interpretation as a hypothesis. And our interpretation goes something like this. So onset phonation first begins a transphonologization process shifting towards register. And that means when it becomes a register language, the original VOT-based contrast of voicing becomes enhanced by additional cues. These cues include pitch and voice quality, and in some cases vowel quality as well, many cases. And this kind of shift in onset phonation in the direction of pitch, for example, is cross-linguistically common. It's very common in Southeast Asia, but we also find it in other parts of the world as well. And so that's a very natural thing to happen. So we consider this kind of enhancement of the old voicing contrast to be the first step in this interpretation. And then in those languages which enhance the voicing contrast with overt differences of pitch and or voice quality, we imagine that these laryngeal gestures that are associated with register begin to interact with differences of codephonation, which are on the right edge of the word. So now, as a result, you end up with complex laryngeal gestures integrating into distinct patterns across the syllable, back to front. And then we imagine a long period of redundancy where the onset phonation and codephonation contrasts and this emergent tonality that is born out of their interaction could go on for quite some time.
Okay, Ryan, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Ricardo. And then when that redundancy is eventually lost or minimized in any case, we get similar to things that we are comfortable calling tone in modern languages. So with all that in mind, let's return to our question. So can we reconcile this historical evidence and the story it tells up here on the surface with the comparative evidence and the story it appears to tell on the surface? And I answer emphatically yes. And I think it's very important that we take both kinds of evidence seriously. So the way forward that I propose is that we appreciate stages of redundancy more than perhaps we have in the past when interpreting written records. So, for example, if we consider the Chia-Yun rhyme tables and the Sukhothai orthography that I described, if the speakers of those languages had a tonal system that was marked by the kind of redundancy that I've just outlined, then they would run into a problem when it comes time to encode these contrasts that are redundant. In states of redundancy, we have to rely on an interpretation to name or encode a contrast, right? Some aspect of it will get privileged. So in an orthographic rendering, for example, if we consider examples like English beat versus bead, we have a redundancy there of differences of voicing on the coda and differences of length in the vowel. And when it comes time to render this orthographically, you could write both, but in most cases, it's clear that we end up making a choice when we name or encode the contrast. In the English case, we encode it on the coda consonant, not on the vowel. So the proposal is that early Middle Chinese and Sukhothai Thai were probably transitional tone languages marked by redundancy and simultaneous mutually influencing change. So both codephonation and onset phonation differences were accompanied by emergent pitch and voice quality cues. And this is not a revolutionary idea if you're familiar with the literature on Chinese and Southeast Asian languages. This quote from Puli Blank here back in 1978 basically asserts the same idea that you must really reconstruct early Middle Chinese in this way as a being marked with this kind of redundancy in the proto-tone categories. And we also see it in modern languages. With lots of conservative emergent tone languages we can look at. And in those cases, we find just this kind of redundancy of the phonation categories with the emergent, more overtly tonal properties like voice quality and pitch. So I think I'll skip that in the interest of time. And I just want to go through this real briefly, the influence of the traditional linguistic science of India on the development of these orthographies or these ways of analyzing writing. So in Buddhist learning, the correct pronunciation of Sanskrit and Pali chants and mantras is actually of the utmost importance, because for them to be effective, you have to pronounce them correctly. And so there's a great emphasis on pronunciation and real orthographic specificity in the Buddhist tradition. And so if we ask ourselves, how would they pronounce Indic loanwords that had voiced onsets at the time? For example, the name of the Buddha. If we look at the onsets and tones that are in the languages in modern Thai and modern Chinese, they very clearly point to historical voiced onsets, right? But what if they weren't producing those as strictly VOT-based voicing contrasts on their initial stops? What if it was actually a register contrast with a number of redundant cues? Well, if that's the way they pronounce the name of the Buddha, then they were likely to encode or name the low register as voice stops because of their familiarity with how to spell the word Buddha in using an Indic script. And they really would have had no incentive to reinterpret it as something new because they would be producing that word the same way as they produce the rest of their voiced Bs, right? And by extension, the other places of articulation as well. So in that scenario, conservatism in the naming of the contrast, if you want to call it naming, right? The selection of the voice glyph to interpret it is almost certain. And so very briefly, they had 3 pitch accents that you could mark in Vedic Sanskrit. This was inherited from the PIE pitch accent system, Proto-Indo-European. And this was described by the Buddhist scholars. And so the Buddhist scholars in China and Thailand at the time would have been well aware of these. And by chance, they themselves had a 3-way contrast to encode, which we call the A, B, and C tone categories, right? And so they, very easy to see how they modeled their interpretation of those categories along the same lines and thought of them in the same way. So to summarize then, the interpretation of the historical sources came first, and it included overt assumptions about the phonetic realities of the orthographic categories, read at face value, more or less. But then, as I've laid out, the modern comparative evidence suggests a different story, that what we have considered to be onset voicing may actually encode register, and what we have called tone marks or tone groups may encode a hybrid phonation contrast with overt pitch cues. So actually, this story is compatible with the historical evidence, but only when we're willing to soften our stance on the traditional phonetic assumptions. And as I've experienced by pushback in talking about these things, that kind of old habit dies hard, and that's as it should be. But thank you for the chance to share these ideas with you today.
Thank you, Ryan, again. And let's give the floor to Tatiana.
Okay, so hello, my name is Tatiana Reid. And in this presentation, I will speak about untangling the origins of the floating suprasegmental component in Nuer. So in keeping with the theme of this panel, this talk is about investigations into a little documented language and the phenomenon, the origins of which the study aims to untangle, is of the suprasegmental nature, which makes it a tick more elusive than the segmental phenomenon. So I will talk about the benefits and challenges of working with a little documented language encountered in the course of this study. So this talk is structured as follows. I will first provide the language background, followed by the description of the phenomenon. I will then discuss the kinds of data that I have used to study diachrony. And this includes the synchronic data, the cognate data, and the written records. Now, Nuer is a West Nilotic language spoken in South Sudan and Ethiopia within a rather sizable area of 166 square kilometers. And there is a considerable dialect variation, which is not fully understood at present. The Nuer phonology is notoriously complex, and here I will not go into the details as the issue is orthogonal to the present talk. I will, however, comment on some essentials relevant to the data that I will be presenting and on the principles that I employed in transcription. So first, there is a 3-way vowel length contrast. Monophthongs and diphthongs can be phonemically short, long, or overlong. Second, there are 3 tonemes, high, mid, and low, as well as various allatones, such as the rise and the fall, that you will see in the data. And the allatones are shown in a surface phonological representation between the square brackets. The tonemes are shown in a representation, underlying representation without any brackets. Now, in addition to allotony, the contours could be due to a combination of level tones. So whenever possible, I signal this through placing two diacritics next to each other. Now, the floating suprasegmental components will be represented in the underlying representation by using the Greek letter mu to signal that it contains a weight unit, a mora. Now, let us examine the phenomenon in question. Some Nuer nouns have a floating suprasegmental component abbreviated as FSC. FSC consists of a floating mora and a high tone that occur at the left edge of nouns. And FSC is realized only with the addition of the preceding context. So examples in the table here show the noun child, which is the ordinary noun that does not have FSC, and the noun dog person, where dog being the name of one of the Nuer clans. And this noun has FSC. So when the two words occur in isolation, they both are realized as monosyllabic. That is, the FSC is not realized in this context. And I will play the sound examples.
Gut, dog.
Now, the difference becomes apparent when the words occur preceded by some context. In this case, they are preceded by a short, low-toned suffix vowel. Before the ordinary noun, the suffix vowel is short and low-toned. Before the noun with FSC, however, the vowel lengthens and there is a change in the tonal melody. So here you see the waveforms and the F0 traces of the nouns and the preceding vowel. So we can see that there is a difference in duration. Before child, the vowel is 73 milliseconds, and before dog person, it is 111 milliseconds. And there is a change in F0 from a low level to a rise. I will now play the sound files.
Hanana gat. Hanana dog.
Of course, faced with a phenomenon like this, we would want to know about the origins of it. So one of the avenues of investigation in the study was the synchronic data. And that is the data that I collected with the Nuer speakers. So in what follows, I will describe the kinds of data used in the study. I will then speak about dialect variation and the benefits of working with a number of dialects. And lastly, I will speak about the challenges associated with the context in which the study was carried out, namely was conducted among the Nuer diaspora outside of the native territories. Now, for this study, I used two kinds of data, elicited data and the recorded narratives. Now, saying that, most of the hypotheses were generated with the help of the elicited data, and the narratives were used to corroborate the analysis. So the elicited data was deemed superior in this research as it allowed me to collect tightly controlled data sets. So in particular, since I was interested in the effects of FSC in the preceding context, I constructed a number of semantically and grammatically plausible sentences varying the parameters of the context before the noun. So for example, there were closed and open preceding syllables, which had different tonal specifications. And with the open syllables, I also varied the length of the vowel. And the relevant data was also found in the narratives, as this sentence from the North Wind and the Sun story shows, where the low toned vowel before the noun with FSC lengthens and changes in the tonal melody. However, although the relevant data does occur in the recorded text, it is not as exhaustive in terms of the preceding context as one would want it to be. So relying on this kind of data alone without having access to the speakers would have made the investigation to stretch out in time quite considerably. And that is only on the condition that there is a lot of the recorded narratives available, which is not at all the case for Nuer. Now here, I will speak about my decisions for choosing to work with this or other dialects. Now, I started working with the speakers of the Eastern Sudanese, of the South Sudanese dialects, with the Eastern Nuer dialects spoken here at the border with Ethiopia. And that is because those are the people that I had access to. Now, at some point, it became clear that what I observed with the Eastern speakers differs from what has been described at the beginning of last century for the Western Nuer by a missionary, Father Kratzolara. So this prompted me to find the speakers from the West. And it also became clear that we cannot just speak of a Western or an Eastern dialect. Instead, there is a considerable variation between the speakers from different areas. So this motivated me to look for speakers from a number of areas within South Sudan. So far, I have identified 6 dialects, but it must be noted that I have not worked with the speakers from all areas I want to check. I estimate that there are around 16 different dialects of Nuer in South Sudan alone. And I hypothesize that the dialects follow the county system that is shown on this map here. The reason for this rather neat arrangement is that the division into the counties is rather recent. It occurred well after the South Sudanese independence in 2011, and the split into the counties reflects the division into Nuer clans. Now, in addition to the differences of the geographical nature, there are also differences that relate to age groups. For example, I investigated vowel lengthening due to FSC with a number of speakers from the same area. And the speakers who were in their 70s had considerably longer durations than the speakers in their 40s. So that this suggests to me that the contrast is becoming smaller in the younger speakers. Now, here is a rather busy slide to show the benefits of working with a number of dialects rather than a single dialect. Now, we have the data here from 3 dialects, which I will call dialects 1, 2, and 3. For each, the same 2 sentences are given featuring our earlier words with FSC doc person. Now, it must be noted that the phonological composition of the noun differs depending on the dialect. It is doit in dialect 1, doc in dialect 2, and doak in dialect 3. But in all the 3 dialects, the word is monosyllabic. It has a short vowel and a low tone, and most importantly, it contains FSC, as is evident from the effect on the preceding context. The 2 preceding contexts shown in the table are 1 where the preceding vowel is low-toned, and 2 where the preceding vowel is high-toned. Now we can see that in the dialects 1 and 2, FSC triggers vowel lengthening in both of the contexts. Whereas in the dialect 3, vowel lengthening occurs only in the context 1, the low-tone context, but not in the context 2, the high-tone context. With respect to tone, a change in tonal melody occurs in both contexts in dialect 2, and only in the low tone context in the dialects 1 and 3. Now that I have given this super fast presentation of a rather complex data, I'm going to move to the analysis for each dialect, as this reveals something rather interesting. So the data from the dialects 1 and 2 is what led me to hypothesize that FSC consists of a floating mora and a high tone, since there is the evidence that both the mora and the high tone cross the word boundary to associate with the preceding syllable. Now, there is a difference between these 2 dialects with respect to the tonal behavior, namely the tonal change in context 2 occurs only for the dialect 2. Now, this is a phenomenon that I call dissimilatory lowering, and it is where the second high in the sequence becomes low. And this process is attested across all Nuer dialects, but only in dialect 2 in this particular context. Now, the dialect 3 is an outlier as far as the effects of the FSC on the preceding context are concerned. Namely, vowel lengthening and tone change occur only when the preceding context is low-toned, but not when it is high-toned. And the most economical analysis for these dialects is to assume that FSC consists of a floating high tone alone, and that in context 1, the vowel lengthens in order to accommodate this floating high tone. Now, dialect 3 is objectively an outlier, and this is suggested by the data from 6 Nuer dialects that I work with so far, whereas dialects 1 and 2 pretty much represent the majority. Now, what is very interesting is that the Nuer orthography has been modeled on the dialect 3, and for the reason no other than the American mission that developed the standard orthography was stationed in the area of the dialect 3. Now, we will touch on the written data a little later, but this suggests that the written records can potentially be underrepresentative. Now, one of the major challenges in my work with the Nuer community is the lack of access to the native territories. All of my work so far has been conducted with the speakers that either live abroad or in the South Sudanese capital, Juba. And although the first generation of the Nuer migrants tend to live within the close-knit communities, they do not stay within their dialects or clan groups, of course. And because of that, they are exposed to various Nuer dialects other than their own. And it is not uncommon for the speakers to lack in consistency with respect to how they speak. And this is particularly relevant to the speakers from the West, whose dialects are saliently different from the speakers from the rest of the dialects. And the modification is in favor of the dialects spoken in the East. This also could be due to the fact that the speakers are literate and relatively read the Bible that is modeled on the dialect 3, which is one of the Eastern dialects. Now, and the younger Western speakers tend to be the most inconsistent in this respect, and this suggests that there is a tendency towards homogeneity among the younger population.
Okay,
now,
Tatiana, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to be as fast as I can. So the next avenue of investigation was the cognate data. And this, of course, is something that is used widely by the historical linguists. And what differs in this case is that most of the data on West Nilotic languages is relatively recent. So the table here shows the cognate data from 3 languages of the Dinka Nuer sub-branch. As we can see, Nuer is the only language within its sub-branch that lacks vowel initial nouns. And the cognates that have FSC in Nuer have word initial vowel A in Ril and in Dinka. So this suggests that FSC originates from this vowel. So the absence of the vowel initial nouns in Nuer appears to be a relatively recent development. And this is because we know that the Ril speakers, the language where the vowel is still intact, have separated from the Nuer some 500 years ago. Now, we also know that this vowel was absent in Nuer at the beginning of the last century, where a number of missionaries made linguistic records of Nuer. So I therefore hypothesize that the vowel A was lost somewhere between 500 and 100 years ago. Now, the final avenue of investigation is the written data. So as previously mentioned, Nuer orthography was developed in the mid-20th century in a course of Bible translation, and it is based on a single dialect, our dialect 3. So with the dialect variation in the realms of phonology, morphology, and syntax, the orthography is not representative of many other Nuer dialects. And it comes as no surprise that tone, of course, is not represented in the orthography. And it is rather amazing to see that the effects of FSC are in fact reflected to some degree in the standard orthography. So consider this text that comes from a primer by SIL. So only one noun in the text have FSC. It is the word lek, pestle. So the Nuer orthography captures vowel lengthening due to FSC in the 2 low-toned function words, the preposition ke and the singular copula e. And these are underlined in red. Now compare the spelling of these words in context before nouns without FSC, underlined in blue. So they are spelled with a single vowel grapheme. Lengthening that occurs elsewhere is not captured in the Nuer orthography, as can be seen in the italicized line showing the orthography of our earlier sentence, where FSC triggers vowel lengthening of the low tone suffix. So the question, of course, is why would the orthography reflect lengthening in some instances, but not in another? Well, recall that only the low toned contexts are subject to lengthening in the dialect 3 on which orthography is modeled. So I hypothesize that the orthography reflects lengthening only in the stable low toned contexts. And that is, the two function words are always low toned. And as such, they always lengthen in the dialect 3 with the addition of FSC. Suffixes, as we saw earlier, can be either low or high toned. And as such, lengthening in suffixes does not occur consistently in dialect 3. And this is likely to be the reason for why the standard orthography does not reflect lengthening in the suffixes. So overall, it is rather telling that the contrast is represented at all. And this tells us that the phenomenon is salient enough to be reflected in the orthography. Now, here we come to the conclusions. And in this presentation, I have shown that the hypothesis about the historical origins of FSC in Nuer grew out of, first of all, traditional approaches employed by historical linguists. That is, I worked with the cognate West Nilotic data. And in addition, my work was informed by working towards description of Nuer dialects. With respect to two, I find that much like the cognate data, the dialect data show us a bigger picture about the phenomena we investigate. And it unravels things that we would otherwise not be able to see if only looking at a single dialect, or what's even worse, an idialect. So in other words, studying dialect variation gives us a more representative picture of the phenomena under study. And the lesson learned is that although in this case, the written records confirms the presence of FSC, it is underrepresentative of the phenomenon, and it is based on an outlier dialect. So this raises a question of how much faith we should place on the written records in general. I also spoke about the tendency towards homogeneity in the diaspora with the tilt towards the Eastern dialects. And it is likely to be so because of the standard Nuer orthography. And because there is a tendency to do away with the salient dialect features, I would say that it is best to conduct research in the native territories with the speakers who have not traveled and or are illiterate. So finally, I hope I was able to convince you that it is entirely possible to conduct a study into the historical origins of a linguistic phenomena in a little described or documented language. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. And once again, now it's time for our last talk. Laura Arnold, if you are ready, please take it away.
Sure thing. Thanks very much. And thanks to Ryan and Tatiana for two very interesting and engaging talks. And thanks once again to Ricardo for chairing, and to the Philological Society for the invitation to organize this event. Great to see so many of you here on what in Europe at least is a Friday evening. So I'm going to be extending this discussion out along three dimensions. So first, rather than inherited internal change and reconstruction, I'm going to be focusing on how to identify contact-induced changes in languages without a written record. Second, I'm going to be focusing on morphosyntactic change rather than phonological change. And third, I'm not just going to be talking about the data that I've collected myself in the field, but I'm also going to be bringing in data collected by others and then encoded, for example, in grammars or in dictionaries. And in a nutshell, I'm going to be arguing that in order to more fully understand contact-induced changes in languages without a historical record, we need to pay careful attention to the present-day sociolinguistic situations in which these languages are spoken, as it is in this context, without written records, this is very important evidence to be able to infer the nature of the historical, or indeed the prehistorical interactions between different language groups. So here's an outline for the talk. After a brief introduction to models of and best practices in identifying contact-induced change, I'm going to highlight some of the challenges in identifying contact using a case study of a phenomenon which I call split inalienable coding in Northwest New Guinea. I'm then going to conclude by suggesting that while contact-induced change operates along broadly similar lines cross-linguistically, we should think about refining our models for local contexts by taking into account observations of contact and change in the present-day linguistic ecologies in which change is initiated and spread. So first of all, what do we mean by contact-induced change? Here I'm going to take a standard definition by Thomason that a linguistic change can be ascribed, at least in part, to contact if it is less likely that this change would have occurred outside of a given contact event. In order to better understand the challenges of identifying contact-induced change in languages without a written record, I thought it would be helpful first to think about how we can use written records in studies of contact. So, for example, where there are ample historical records of a donor language and a recipient language, of two languages in contact, we can carry out corpus studies to actually track the variation and change in one language which is in contact with another. So a really nice example of this is from our very own Lisa Gotthard here at the University of Edinburgh, in which she uses a past corpus to investigate syntactic change in Scots as a result of contact with English in the 16th to 18th centuries. Second, historical records can provide evidence for the geographic extent of a language or a language family. So, for example, the discovery of Tocharian manuscripts in the Tarim Basin in the early 20th century provided a neat explanation for Indo-European loanwords into Old Chinese. Finally, written records may also provide indirect evidence of migrations and invasions and contact events resulting from these events. For example, in accounts by Greek and Roman historians describing Germanic migrations in Western Europe in the 4th to 6th centuries, which, as I understand, is not strongly supported by the archaeological record. So in this case, we rely on the written records for this information. Now, Thomason outlines the conditions that must be met in order to confidently identify contact as a source for change. So first, we identify a recipient language, which we can call B, and then a source language, A, which was in contact with B. We then identify a range of features shared by both A and B from across the linguistic system, preferably from different linguistic subsystems, so some from phonology, for example, some from morphology, some from syntax, in order to reduce the risk that we're looking at chance-independent innovation. And then fourth and fifth, we need to show that the shared features were present in language A before the contact, but weren't present in B. And in the case of unwritten languages, this criterion is normally satisfied through reconstruction and thus demonstrating that a given feature was found in an ancestral proto-language of A, for example, but not in that of B. So with this background in mind, let's take a look at the distributions, origins, and spread of split inalienable coding in Northwest New Guinea. First of all, a definition of split inalienable coding. So some of you might be familiar with the notion of alienability in possessive constructions. And the term alienability is actually used in several different ways in the literature, but for my purposes, I use a formal definition. So a language has an alienability distinction if there are two formally distinct possessive constructions, one of which, the inalienable construction, is used to express inalienable possessive relationships. So, for example, when the possessed noun is a body part or a kin term, and the other, which the alienable construction, which is used to express all other kinds of possessive relationships. So, for example, relationships of ownership, relationships of association, creation, and so forth. Languages with split inalienable coding have not just two, but they have at least three distinct possessive constructions, at least two of which are used to code inalienable possessive relations. And in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on semantically conditioned inalienable splits. In a language with a semantically conditioned inalienable split, there are three possessive constructions. One is used for body parts, the second is used for kin terms, and the third possessive construction is used for all other possessive relationships. So to make this more concrete, here's some data from Hatam, which is one of the languages spoken in Northwest New Guinea. So Hatam has three possessive constructions, which for convenience I've labeled alienable in A here, inalienable 1 in B, and inalienable 2 in C. Now in the alienable possessive construction in A, the person and number of the possessor, the second singular possessor, is marked with this prefix on a pre-nominal possessive particle de. Whereas in the two inalienable constructions in B and C, we get the person and number of the possessor marked directly onto the possessed noun with a prefix. Now, if we look closely at the two inalienable constructions, you'll see that the form of the prefix differs. So here in B, where the possessed noun is hand, we have this prefix a, whereas in C, where the possessed noun is wife, kin term wife, we have prefix at. And this difference in the shape of prefixes is in fact systematic in Hatam, such that there are two separate paradigms, inalienable paradigms. When the possessed noun is a kin term, we have this thematic archiphonemic element T here in the prefixes, whereas if the possessed noun is a body part, we don't have this element. So the split in Hatam is morphological, it's paradigmatic, but we also see split inalienables that are in the possessive constructions themselves. So here's some data from Salawati, which is another language of Northwest New Guinea. And again, we've got three different possessive constructions: alienable, inalienable 1, inalienable 2. And in all three constructions, we have this inflected prenominal particle, which marks the person number of the possessor, at nim, here in all three constructions. Now, for the alienable construction, this is the only marker of possession, this particle. But in the two inalienable constructions, we have a different, additional suffixes attaching to the possessed noun, which again cross-reference the person and number. Now, the difference between the two inalienable constructions is that whereas this inflected prenominal particle is obligatory when the possessed noun is a kin term, it's optional when the possessed noun is a body part. Okay, so before looking at the distribution of split inalienables in Northwest New Guinea, let's take a look at the local linguistic context. So here's a map of New Guinea, the island of New Guinea here, just to the north of Australia. And if you look, it kind of looks a little bit like a bird, and we often refer to this area here as the bird's head. And this is the region that I'm going to be focusing on. So the bird's head region plus the nearby coasts and islands. Now, Northwest New Guinea is a region of extremely high genealogical diversity. There are a few dozen Austronesian languages spoken in the region. These are marked in orange on the map here. Most of these Austronesian languages belong to the South-Hamahara West New Guinea sub-branch, which I'll call Shweng for short. But we also have, a bit further along the coast here, we have some oceanic languages, and we have some non-Shweng Austronesian languages down on the Bombay Peninsula here. The Austronesian languages are comparatively recent incomers to the area. This has arrived around 3,000 years ago. And they're spoken alongside the endemic non-Austronesian languages of Northwest New Guinea, which are presumed to have been spoken here since humans first arrived in the area some 50,000 years ago. And the count of how many different genealogical entities, non-Austronesian genealogical entities we have in Northwest New Guinea vary, but there may be as many as 16 distinct language families and isolate groups. So let's take a look at the distribution of split inalienables in Northwest New Guinea and the surrounding area. So on this map, the crosses mark Austronesian languages and the circles mark non-Austronesian languages. The white markers indicate that a language doesn't have an alienability distinction, so just has a single possessive construction, which is used to express all kinds of possessive relationship. The black markers are languages with an alienability distinction. So two possessive constructions, one for alienable possession, one for inalienable possession. And then the blue markers are the languages that we're interested in here. These are the languages with at least 3 separate possessive constructions. These are the languages that split. So we can see this clustering of blue markers in the northwest around the bird's head and nearby coasts and islands. In total, there are 11 languages in the region with split inalienable. Now, of these 11, 3 are non-Austronesian on the back of the bird's head here. And these 3 non-Austronesian languages belong to 2 separate families. We've got Maya and Moskona here, which both belong to the 3-language East Bird's Head family. And we have Hatam spoken here by the coast, which belongs to a very small 2-language family called Hatam Mansin. And then the remaining 8 languages with split inalienables are all Austronesian. Now, before ascribing this distribution to contact between the languages, we must, of course, first consider some other viable explanations. So first, can this distribution be explained by chance, for example, by multiple independent innovations of split inalienables? Probably not, because split inalienable coding appears to be very rare worldwide. So far, I've only been able to identify around half a dozen independent innovations of split inalienables outside of this Northwest New Guinea region, which means it's very unlikely that split inalienable coding was spontaneously innovated 11 times in Northwest New Guinea. In addition, inheritance can't be the sole explanation of split inalienables in Northwest New Guinea, as we see it's attested in 3 unrelated families, in East Birdshead, in Hatam Mansiam, and in Austronesian. But we might ask, has inheritance played some role in the present day distribution? And the answer is yes, but only in the 2 East Birdshead family, East Birdshead languages, Maya and Moscona. So these 2 languages form a sub-branch within the 3 language family to the exclusion of 3rd language Sob. And Sob doesn't have split inalienables, so we can't reconstruct split inalienables to Proto-East Birdshead. But the split inalienable systems are cognate in Maya and Moscona, so we can reconstruct split inalienables to their most recent common ancestor. But if we turn to the Austronesian languages with the distinction, we don't find any evidence at all to reconstruct split inalienables higher in the family tree than the present day attested languages. So even closely related languages don't have cognate systems. We see this, for example, with Ambai and Wamesa, which are both members of the West Yapen branch of Shuang. In Ambai, a 3rd singular possessor of body parts is marked with the suffix n, and a 3rd singular possessor of kin terms is marked with the suffix na. Whereas in Wamesa, a 3rd singular possessor of body parts is marked with a determiner enclitic, which typically takes the form pa, and kin terms with this suffix ni. Similarly, in the Raja Ampat Salhamahera sub-branch of Shuang, in Ambel, a 3rd singular possessor of body parts is unmarked, and a 3rd singular possessor of kin terms is marked with the prefix e. Whereas in Salawati, as we saw a minute ago, the distinction between the 2 constructions is in the optionality of the pre-non. So this really only leaves contact as a likely explanation for the distribution of this cross-linguistically unusual feature across genealogically diverse languages in Northwest New Guinea. As we've just seen, split inalienable coding doesn't have a great antiquity in Austronesian. And in fact, some of the Austronesian languages with split inalienables have only split from their closest relatives, which don't have split inalienables in the last few hundred years or so. So we're looking at a very shallow level change. But we also saw that split inalienables can be reconstructed to the Proto-Maya branch in East Birdshead, which suggests that it has a comparatively deep time depth here. So based on these observations, I think it's reasonable to assume that split inalienables originated in the non-Austronesian languages on the back of the bird's head. But here we run into our first problem, because there's no evidence of any kind for recent contact of the intensity required for this transmission, contact-induced transmission of this kind of morphosynthetic change between these 3 non-Austronesian languages and all of the Austronesian languages dotted around the coast here, at least not in the last few years. But there is some evidence to suggest that these 3 non-Austronesian languages have been in contact to some extent with the Austronesian language Biak, which is spoken on Biak Island here, and that split inalienables first spread in a contact zone involving East Birdshead, Hatam, and Biak. There's then some further evidence to suggest that over the last few hundred years, Biak has functioned as the vector for spread to the other Austronesian languages of the area. So for this contact zone involving East Birdshead, Hatam, and Biak, I'll be referring to this as stage 1. And for the subsequent spread via Biak to the other Austronesian languages, I'll be referring to this as stage 2. However,
we already have 5 minutes. Sorry.
Thank you very much. The evidence for these 2 stages is not conclusive, and we do have to do a lot of inference and extrapolation from the evidence that we have. And this is what I'm going to be talking about in the remainder of the presentation. So first of all, let's return to the criteria for establishing contact as a source for change. Thomason herself points out that it may not always be possible to satisfy all 5 of these criteria. I'm going to be illustrating this with the data from split inalienables in Northwest New Guinea. So, for example, ideally, we should have independent non-linguistic evidence of contact between the languages. Now, in Northwest New Guinea, this poses a pretty major problem, because not only do we not have written records, that archaeological studies are very much in their infancy in the region, and we don't have any, for example, genetic studies that have been carried out in the region at all. So linguistic data is really like our primary data for understanding the history of contact events in the region. But from oral histories, colonial records, and present-day observations about the sociolinguistic situations, we can piece together some evidence for contact between at least some of the languages. So, for example, it's very clear that the East Bird's Head languages and Hatam have been in very intimate contact for some time. So, for example, their origin myths placed their homelands near to each other, and then they migrated to their present-day locations at similar times and along similar trajectories, and for similar reasons. There are very high levels of intermarriage between the East Bird's Head groups and Hatam, with as many as 40% of marriages across these tribal boundaries in the middle of the 20th century. There isn't, as far as I'm aware, any evidence for contact between Biak and East Bird's Head directly, but there are some suggestions that the Biak and the Hatam have been intermarrying since the 18th century. For example, there's one documented Hatam myth which ends with the marriage between a Hatam clan and a Biak clan. Now, one of the main reasons for considering Biak to be the vector for spread to the other Austronesian languages at stage 2 is that the Biak have a very strong reputation throughout the whole of northwest New Guinea as wanderers, as explorers, and settlers, and they've expanded far beyond their traditional homeland on Biak Islands. There is some direct evidence for intermarriage between the Biak and other groups, for example, the Ambel and the Wanesa and Ambai, as well as other cultural correlates of contact with these groups in terms of similarities in ritual figurines, and widespread attestations of a mythical figure known as Manamakeri and an associated messianic movement. But there is also some limited evidence for intermarriage between the Biak and the Sobe. But for some of the groups, for example, Irarutu and Salawati, we just don't have this information. We're inferring contact solely from the putative linguistic outcomes. Similarly, another of Thomason's criteria is to identify a range of linguistic correlates of contact from different systems. And here things get shakier still. So, for example, at stage 1, the only potential linguistic correlates of contact shared by the East Bird's Head languages, Hatam and Biak, is the presence of a certain kind of productive adverbial count, and there's some purported lexical and morphological borrowing between Hatam and Biak. But besides this, we don't really have any supporting evidence. Similarly, for contact between Biak and the other Austronesian languages at stage 2, we have some evidence of potential lexical loans, which often ascribe to Biak, but better evidence is needed here. And grammatical loans on the similar time depths to split available. So just to finish off, an additional problem when looking at contexts in languages without a written record is that they tend to be spoken in quantitatively and qualitatively different linguistic ecologies when compared with those of languages with a lengthy written record. So, for example, populations tend to be smaller, more rural, more mobile, and subsistence tends to be small-scale agriculture or hunter-gathering. So it's already well known that models of contact developed with evidence from large-scale agricultural societies may not always be applicable in these small-scale contexts. So, for example, while contact effects are typically thought to be in an implicational hierarchy, with lexical borrowing preceding grammatical borrowing, there's ample evidence from small-scale societies that this isn't always the case. Indeed, the highly localized dynamics of linguistic ecologies will have an impact on which changes are induced by contact and then subsequently spread throughout a community. However, there's still a lot that we don't know about this domain, particularly in the region, with a couple of noteworthy exceptions. For example, recent work by Eric Shima, Francesca Morrow, George Sad. We lack empirical data on variation and change in contact situations in Guinea. And there are a few observations from elsewhere in New Guinea that suggest we may need to develop these localized models of language contact. So, for example, Donahue and Crowther show several unrelated languages in North New Guinea have undergone phonological convergence, which would normally point to intense long-term contact. But evidence from oral histories and written and colonial records shows that the languages have only come into contact very recently. Evans also observes that the languages of the Moorhead district in South New Guinea have been in very close contact for some time, involving intermarriage and high levels of multilingualism, and yet the languages remain distinct. So further typologically distinct in terms of features such as presence versus lack of inclusivity distinction. So further work is definitely needed here. First of all, to substantiate these observations and these studies, and also to figure out what is it about the languages of, for example, the Moorhead district that inhibits convergence. Is this some peculiarity of the local linguistic ecology, or are there relevant structural features? So I'll leave it there. I'll just say an additional factor to bear in mind is that these linguistic ecologies in Northwest New Guinea, as in many other regions of the world where these small-scale ecologies exist, many of them are endangered, so we are in serious need of further documentary and empirical studies, which can then feed into our understanding of local language content. So thanks to my sponsors, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Laura. This was very interesting.
And just thank Ricardo and Ryan, Tatiana and Laura very much indeed for a fantastic panel, really thoughtful, incredibly constructive, and I think a great deal for everybody to learn. So this has been an object lesson and a fantastic ECR panel for the Philological Society. So thank you very much indeed, everybody.